Hi, this is Paul, and it is Friday, which means it's time for a rough draft for Sunday. Now, I am definitely going to be on vacation next week. Definitely. It's the plan. And so I have a substitute preacher, so I will not be preaching on August 19 at Living Stones. I will hopefully be someplace else, having a lovely vacation with my wife. So that's the plan. So probably not too many, if any, videos next week, and no rough draft for Sunday next week. And rough draft for Sunday is where I run through the current state of the current state of my sermon, and it very well may change from Friday to Sunday. Often does. The way of the world. A little bit of presidential trivia for you. Can anyone name, at Donald Trump's inaugural ball, the first song they played where he and his young, beautiful third wife danced to, and he sang along with the song? It was by Frank Sinatra, and it was My Way. I Did It My Way. And I think that song will probably typify a lot of the Trump presidency. Donald Trump is used to getting his own way. He's gotten his way with money. He's gotten his way in business. He's gotten his way in wives. He likes getting his own way. Now, if you imagine that separates you from him, I think you're probably wrong. We all like getting our own way, and this is the way of the world. If you are experiencing personhood, you have desires and you have things that you want, and it's satisfying to get your way. Now, one of the things that I've learned over the last few months, last year or so, in studying Jordan Peterson, and have appreciated, are hierarchies. That there are hierarchies in nature, that there are hierarchies between humans, within ourselves, ideas within ourselves. There are values, there's power. If I am hungry, if I am desperately hungry, I will forego many pleasures like diversions or watching TV in order to satisfy those needs. Hierarchies, or talking about hierarchies, is a very easy way to begin to figure out how we act and why we act. Now, when it comes to hierarchies, there's a lot of trying and settling. Sometimes we settle at a lower position in the hierarchy. One of the things that we're very much in tune with is status, and we try to gain status. We'll look for opportunities to gain status, and this drives a lot of human motivation. Now, you might say, well, these hierarchies are how human beings spoil each other by competition in society. But there's good evidence to say that hierarchies are very much within nature. And Rousseau, who imagined that nature is innocent and blissful and kind and pure, and we're only corrupted by other human beings and by human society, seems pretty much wrong. Here is one wolf intimidating another wolf. We kick down and we kiss up, and that wolf that is taking the submissive posture is in fact kissing up. Now, it's always mediated because the dominant wolf understands the consequences of killing the submissive wolf, and so he bares his teeth instead of biting him. And again, this is pretty common animal behavior, and this consequence, by the way, is also pretty common human behavior. But human beings have lots of hierarchies, way more than wolves. We have hierarchies about strength, intelligence, wisdom, money, skill, political power, importance, math, science, basketball, football, baseball, country music, rap music, pop music, punk music, chess. We have lots of hierarchies, and so we multiply the number of ways that we compete with each other. And you might be a really terrible athlete, but a terrific pianist, and so you feel good about yourself because you're a wonderful pianist and you feel yourself up on the hierarchy. It's not unlike Lake Wobegon, where all the children are above average. And these are the kind of common consolations that human beings have. And maybe I can't get it my way in everything I do, but maybe I can get it my way in my own marriage or among my children or in my own little communities, and that satisfies me. And so I settle for lower places, and make my life as best I can. But then we have this question, what is God? And Jordan Peterson defines God as that which is at the top of all the hierarchies. And that's a very interesting definition. And actually, if you go back way before Jordan Peterson to the gods of the philosophers, we have these omnis. God is omnipotent. He can do anything. God is omnipresent. He can impact events any place. God is omniscient. He knows everything. God is most beautiful. God is the source of all beauty, the source of all goodness, the source of all light, the source of all blessing, and the source of all power. And so God sits up at the top of all of the hierarchies. Now, if we take that God of the philosophers and have that God meet the God of the Bible, things can be very interesting, because people, if you have only Aristotle's unmoved mover God, you begin to wonder, why would God create the world? Now, the movie The Color Purple, I think, has a little bit of wisdom for that. Two women are walking through a field, and one asks, one says, I think it just ticks God off when you walk by the color purple and don't notice. And the other one says, are you saying God is vain? And the other saying, no, he's just trying to share a good thing. And the good thing that God is trying to share is the best, because if God is in fact on the top of all the hierarchies, and God is in fact has all the omnis, and God is in fact all generous, then he shares these things down to us, and we in fact selectively and in limited measure participate in all of this goodness. And so if you read the story of Genesis, God places the man and the woman in the garden, and they are told to garden, which means to develop. And actually, I just watched a video, maybe I'll drop it. So God creates sub-creators and places them in a garden to garden. And just this morning I found an interesting video on YouTube, 10 foods that originally looked totally different, and they go through corn and peaches and avocados and watermelon, and they show all of the ways that over thousands of years we have been modifying and changing these foods to be much more pleasing to us. We are sub-creators. We take the glory that is implicit and the potential in the world God gives us, and we magnify it. But now here's a consequence. Do we magnify it along the line of God's desire, or do we magnify it along the lines of our rebellion? So what happens in the garden is that the man and the woman rebel, and in a sense they want to take the garden in a different direction. And as a consequence of their rebellion, God limits their power but doesn't destroy them. And this breaks the way of the world script, and this teaches us something about God, because in the end of the story of the Bible, God in fact does get what he wants. That's essentially what the book of Revelation says. But God in many ways wants to have his cake and eat it too. Let's see, I thought I put that in that slide. I guess I didn't. Maybe I will. So our rebellion gives God a particularly difficult challenge. How can God actually redeem us and reclaim us without losing us and still keep his creation? How can we freely love him and freely serve him and freely obey him while we are determined rebels? Well, then the stories start to come. The flood story is, well, we look at the human hierarchy of obedience and save the one very best man. And what does God learn? Or what do we learn? Well, there are no people that won't rebel. And even the best family in the world that is rescued slips back into the same situation as what happened before the flood. You see, we all want to sing, I did it my way. Is this part of what we inherit from God? Is this part of our image? Got to be careful there, because the question is, how can we all want it our way, but how can we all at the same time live within God's way? How can we be free to, how can, in a sense, we want what God wants freely? And that's one way of looking at these questions. And so God starts a new project. and God begins with Abraham, and he goes about it in a very strange way, because he tells Abraham that he's going to make a new people, and he wants the people to trust in his goodness and his generosity towards them. And the one qualification you would imagine the father of a new people, or at least the first couple of a new people would have, would be fertility. And of all the couples in the world, God chooses one that isn't fertile. Abram is 75, Sarah is 65, and so the story of Abraham goes back and forth. Basically, Abraham trying to find one way or another how he can prime the pump on God's plan, and God stopping him at each corner and saying, "No, I will do this for you. I will give this to you. The one thing I want you to know is if you trust me." And of course, the Abraham story goes all the way to the climax of God telling Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac, and Abraham being ready to do so, and God stopping him at the last minute, and then God saying, "Now I know that you believe. Now I know that you trust." And then we on and on and on through the patriarchs, through Moses, we get to the story of Israel, and we've been following that story all through the Old Testament. Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. And the story of Israel is a story of a quest to get people to trust God for their welfare. And the book of Deuteronomy sets this up, and the book of Kings that we've been going through judges the kings based on how well they comply with this formula from the book of Deuteronomy. And so Israel, in a sense, stands in for all of humanity. So Israel, like all of humanity, is really bad at this. We've learned that from Noah. Mistrust is justification then for rebellion, and we've seen that all the way to the garden. And so if God first tries to save the best man in the world, and we see that doesn't work, well then God says, if we would imagine a conversation between us and God presents his dilemma to us, and we would say, well, kill all the bad people, because we instinctively imagine ourselves as being the good people, the people who choose right. Well, God would say, okay, let's try that. And we might say, well, just save the top 10%. And God will say, I'm far riskier than you are at this. I'm going to just save the top best family. And then it all goes bad. And then we say, okay, well, that doesn't work. So let's agree that everyone is a natural-born rebel. So why don't you have a system of carrots and sticks? Why don't you have a system of incentives? Why don't you tell us in clear language that when we do good, you'll bless us, and when we do bad, you'll punish us? Let's call it law. Let's call it reaping and sowing. Let's call it karma. And God says, okay, would you like that system? Let's try that out. Let's take this people that I choose, and let's give this people an abnormal dose of miraculous confirmation to my trust and power, and let me give them the best laws in the world right then, and let's see how they do. And Israel is that test. And how does Israel do? Israel doesn't do well at all. Now, one of the things that is stalking Israel is the story of kingdoms and empires. Now, if you read Yuval Noah Harari's book about the brief history of humanity, he talks quite a bit about empires. Empires are multiple kingdoms consolidated between one ruler or system. And his definition of empire is that, in fact, you have multiple cultural groups with separate territories and identities, and empires take more than 2 or 3, 20 or 30 of them, and they put them together. And the second thing about empire Second, empires are characterized by flexible borders and potentially unlimited appetite. Now, what's interesting is if we look at the definition of empire and we understand God getting what he wants, we very quickly see that empire in many ways is a rival to God. And in fact, if you read the Old Testament and the book of Revelation quite explicitly, you will see that God sees empires as rivals to him. Read the book of Daniel. This is perhaps most clear in the book of Daniel. Now, here's the thing about little Judah, who's supposed to trust God. In many ways, they're a lot like Abraham. Abraham and Sarah were an infertile couple, and their the fulfillment of the promise given to Abraham could only really be done miraculously, and that's rather the point of the Abraham story. And even when Abraham receives that son, the question is, even when God has demonstrated in an extraordinary way his commitment to your well-being, will you trust him? Well, Judah keeps failing the test. See, Judah has a problem. The milk and honey could not compete with the grain production of the Nile or the Fertile Crescent. So Israel and Judah only had autonomy when the empires to their northeast and their west were incapacitated by internal dysfunction. Development closed her window in 586 BC. And we've been telling this story, we've been going through this story in terms of the book of Kings, and what we find Israel falling greater and greater into corruption and basically becoming more and more like all of the other nations around her. Israel and Judah, with each successive generation, becomes more and more like everyone else. But now we turn the question back to God. Can God have it his way, with having us both be the glory of his creation, be his sub-creators, and have the creation finally realize its glorious fulfillment? Or are we rebels who cannot be redeemed? Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 11 years. His mother's name was, always goes through the mother's name when we locate them. Now Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. And so in the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign, on the 10th day of the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, marched against Jerusalem with his whole army. He encamped outside the city and built siege works all around it. The city was kept under siege until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. That's 2 years. By the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine in the city had become so severe that there was no food for the people to eat. When the city wall was broken through and the whole army fled at night through the gate between the two walls near the king's garden, though the Babylonians were surrounding the city, they fled towards Arabah. But the Babylonian army pursued the king and overtook him in the plains of Jericho. All his soldiers were separated from him and scattered, and he was captured. He was taken to the king of Babylon at Rablah, where sentence was pronounced on him. They killed the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. Then they put out his eyes and bound him with bronze shackles and took him to Babylon. On the 7th day of the 5th month in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, commander of the imperial guard and official of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He set fire to the temple of the Lord, the royal palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every important building he burned down. The whole Babylonian army, under the command of the imperial guard, broke down the walls around Jerusalem. Nebuzaradan, the commander of the guard, carried into exile the people who remained in the city, along with the rest of the populace and those who had deserted to the king of Babylon. But the commander left behind some of the poorest people of the land to work the vineyards and the fields. Now this is an existential crisis in the story, because all of the questions of the story are engaged. Can God have it his way? Does the way of the world finally triumph? Was Marduk, the god of the king of Babylon, God and not the God of the Hebrews? Did the Lord's mission fail? Should God hit Control-Alt-Delete on his little computer game and wipe out the whole project and start again, maybe with human beings that aren't quite so rebellious? Is that what God should do? Is that what a good God should do? Is that what the kind of God who is at the top of all the hierarchies should do? How can the God of all power both get his way and subvert the way of the rebels? Because the way of the rebels is the way of the world, because we're all competing against each other, climbing up these little hierarchies to get it our way. How can God save the world from us without destroying us? How can God have his cake and eat it too? Now, to be Israel, and in fact to be Abraham, and in fact to be Jesus, is to have no chance. Is to have no chance to also be Israel? You might think about that. Now, Jesus comes as Israel. Follow that in the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus comes with cloaked power. So he is the God-man. He has all this power, but he cloaks it and he doesn't use it. And pay attention to the temptations he has at the beginning of the story, because the question is, will he come in as God or as a human being? Well, if a human being had all that power, we know what the human being would do. But what does God do with his power? How does God use his power? Can God both use power and not use it the way the world uses it? Can we begin to differentiate what that looks like? We already know what human beings, when they have power, will do. Now, he does not overtly take on the way of the world, but directly, with signs and wonders, shows he's able to. He becomes, however, the victim of power. At the time when human beings would most definitely use power, because we will do almost anything to save our skin, he lays down his power. In fact, he doesn't even take up human power to rescue his own life. And he becomes the victim of the Roman Empire. Empire's main power is, in fact, to take life. But now God's power, via judgment against rebellion, is also manifest in this story. When what we see in this same story is that Jesus also becomes not only the victim of empire, but the victim of God. The replacement victim, the substitute victim for the rebellious people, even though he himself is both free, staying in perfect obedience to God. And so you can see right here in the Jesus story where all of the elements are brought together. Jesus is the perfect man who doesn't rebel. Jesus is the man who has God's own power, who doesn't use this power to save himself or to get his own way. And Jesus, in fact, uses the situation to become the substitute victim in the place of all the guilty rebels, while he himself does not rebel. And of course, in the Christian story, there is resurrection. His submission is vindicated. To refuse the way of the world is to lose. This is obvious. But then with Jesus, also to win. His vicarious sacrifice is received. He pays a debt that rebels cannot pay. And he offers a life the way of the world can't touch. He offers a life the hierarchies can't touch. Because here's the thing. In the way of the world, under normal circumstances, if you fail to climb the hierarchy, if you fail to gain status, if you fail to gain power, you lose. Jesus willingly climbs down the hierarchy. And although he has all status and all power, becomes nothing. And in fact, not only becomes nothing, but dies for the sake of the unjust and the unworthy rebels that have been rebelling all along. And in this way, the power of the sword, which is what, finally, in our systems we say, the state has a monopoly of power. Well, Jesus' way undoes that power because they killed him. They exercised it. But in the resurrection, it's found impotent. So here's the question for you. If this story is true, how will you respond to it? Because here's the thing. You have no money by which to earn your way into this story. It has to be a gift. This way undoes the way of the world. if in fact Jesus is right, and if in fact Jesus' promises are true, that if you live like him, and all your neighbors want you to live like him, because everybody wants us to be the kind of servant and lover that Jesus is, although we seldom want him to be the kind of truth teller Jesus was. But Jesus loves his enemies at the risk, in fact, at the cost of his own well-being. And he says, if you live like me, because of the way of the world, you will die like me, but because of the way of God, you will live with me, and you will reign with me over the world when it's finally set right, over the world where the rebels finally lay down their arms and freely, lovingly, willingly are aligned with the will of the Father, just like Jesus was in his life. So, Jesus comes to us and says, this is a gift. You have no money by which to earn it. This undoes the way of the world. It is just a gift. But if you receive the gift, you are given a new heart. You will live in trust. You will obey not from fear, but from gratitude. Not all at once, bit by bit, not perfected until after you, in fact, in the completion of your current manifestation, are laid down. This is pretty rough, and I've got to add a lot of slides, so I'm going to do that now. So hope you get the point. I probably won't redo it. I've got some visiting to do this afternoon, but thanks for listening.